Friday. That means it's another edition of our podcast, the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. The United State of Our Democracy is the subtitle. We've had a lot to talk about since we started this in January of 2020. We have a lot to talk about this week as well. How are you doing?
I'm fine. You?
Good. Thanks. I'm going to let you start. Big news today. Dueling presidents, we'll call it. Okay. Of course, the United Nations is in New York, and the presidents all over the world have either come or videotaped their major speech outlining their vision and their policy. And among the major topics that President Biden addressed was, of course, Russia and Vladimir Putin. We know that Putin has suffered some serious military setbacks and, of course, has had to retreat a bit. But we had seen a much more militant, aggressive Vladimir Putin, who had a lot to say by way of warning to the United States in particular and to the West. And Biden, of course, was responding to that. So we had some old Cold War tough talk for those of us who were around during the Eisenhower, Khrushchev, Kennedy, Brezhnev, Johnson, and Nixon days. So back to that Cold War on a global scale. What do you think? Are we at risk of a nuclear war? Let's cut right to the chase.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And what saved us was a lesson. I watched this last night again. The Fog of War, a documentary about Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy. That moment, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis, and actual audio files of the conversation, receiving the notes from the Kremlin regarding the CIA's or whoever it was, the intelligence who received word that ships were coming to arm Cuba. Anyway, I'll get back to that. Let's first review Putin's words and what is going to be his strategy going forward. There's a completely different view if you go outside of the United States as what is really going on, but let's just consider that the past. Here's what's going forward. They are mobilizing 300,000 Russian troops to be ready domestically. That hasn't been done since World War II. The areas that are under current control, Russian control in Ukraine, which, by the way, identify Russian, speak Russian, and historically have identified and spoken Russian, will be absorbed. I don't know whether it will be through elections or whatever, or just flat out acquiring them. Of course, make no mistake, they would prefer to go with Moscow versus Kiev, a government that is shelling that part of Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk regions, which were breakaway regions because when the pro-Western government came to power in Kiev, led by a far-right group, the first thing that they did was to make Ukrainian language the official language, targeting these Russian ethnic minorities in the eastern part, and started shelling these breakaway regions because they were fearful of their culture. Anyway, Russia will now absorb these areas, probably Donetsk, Luhansk, eastern parts, the Crimea, of course, and they will be considered part of Russia. And so the strategy now is Putin is becoming entirely defensive. What he's saying is these regions, which are ethnic Russian minorities, will be part of the Russian Federation, and any attack on them will invite a response. And so he's making it clear to the world that he is on the defense, because from the Russian perspective, they have been on the defense. It is my belief that Putin has been stoic because this has been a 20-year process of NATO expansion, on Russian borders, taking one country after the other in Russian sphere of influence, bringing them into NATO, and Ukraine is the last stronghold. It is the most important stronghold for Russia because it has a 1,000-year history with Russia. So that's what's going on. It is very frightening because the way NATO is responding to Putin's words by saying, I am not bluffing, we will use whatever means necessary, even referencing nuclear weapons, NATO's response among strategists is the belief that they could win a limited nuclear war.
Who's the they?
NATO can. And so this is the point where we're at, where we are back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And let me just tell this story, because this is what I was watching last night from the fog of war. McNamara reflecting on these days that they caught wind of this. The Cuban was going to be armed with nuclear missiles. And so Kennedy is saying, what do we do? And of course, you've got the hardliners, and you've really got one person who was the former ambassador. Russia had lived with Khrushchev. And so what happens was they receive a hard message. Basically, if you go any further, we will annihilate you. Followed by a soft message, just ensure that you do not respond, and we will pull away. So they got the hard and the soft. And so the hardliners like Curtis LeMay, of course, were saying, well, let's just nuke and annihilate Cuba. We can win. We can win a nuclear war. I can't remember the ambassador's name who had lived with Khrushchev. He said, respond to the soft message. Jack Kennedy was saying, well, aren't we going to look weak? They gave us a threat. No, you need to respond to the soft message. Khrushchev will appreciate that. He will take it as you allowing yourself to be the hero so that you could go back to the public and you could say, we averted nuclear annihilation. He would look strong before his people. You would look like the savior of the planet. That's what Kennedy did. That's how we averted nuclear war, and that's why we're still able to talk about it to this day. And Robert McNamara said, rule number one, empathize with your enemy. He said these exact words. We need to be in their skin, and we need to see ourselves through their eyes. And that when we have a media today, and this is me talking now, that's incessantly focused on the narrative of Putin as the butcher, the attacker, the invader, and good old innocent United States NATO empire, just being the good guy, just trying to liberate people. No, that is not through the eyes of Russian culture, through Russian geopolitics. This has been a long time coming, and this is the final thing that I'll say. This perhaps goes back to the father of geopolitics, a man by the name of Mackinder, who came up with the heartland theory that he who controls Eastern Europe controls the world island. The world island would be the Eurasian landmass and the continent of Africa. And when he's saying if you control Eastern Europe, he's talking about Ukraine, because Ukraine is the world bread basket. It has the Black Sea, and this is an added bonus. It's sitting on a sea of natural gas. And so George Friedman, CEO of Stratfor, recounted that World War I and World War II were essentially all about keeping Germany and Russia from ever becoming alliances, allies, because if they did, they'd control the world island. And so this has been a battle of the Anglo-American establishment, I call it the London, Manhattan, D.C. axis, that is hell-bent on not allowing Russia to have that influence, because whoever controls Eastern Europe or Ukraine controls the world island, and everybody else is reduced to the status of pawns to sit back and watch and figure out who they want to cheer for, when in all actuality, all we should be cheering for is to cool it down. I'll end like that.
All right. So, broad geopolitical history, appreciation of culture, both sides taking time to understand each other's culture and pathology, domestic politics, all of that. Let's cut to the chase. From the vantage point of Vladimir Putin, regardless of how this is being portrayed in the United States and Western media, in the NATO countries, the fact of the matter is this isn't working for Vladimir Putin. It's not working militarily. It's not working in terms of his position at home. You see, really, I think we can say unprecedented protests, demonstrations at home. Over 1,000, at least as far as we know, over 1,000 people being arrested, and actually the demonstrations and the heat rising with each passing day. The calling up or the mobilizing of 300,000 troops is in fact a draft of people of young men mainly, who were essentially not trained and who in many instances don't want to go. Morale on the other side of the border inside Ukraine is at a low. In many ways, and you know, we have history to fall back on. We talk about the power, the sheer size of Russian, previously Soviet troops, but the bottom line is, if they're not being fed adequately, if they're being tossed into a situation they don't know, they don't understand, they don't want, plus their families, multiply those troops times the size of their families, what you're getting is a pent-up opposition, both on the front lines and within Russia at the moment. And so if you look at Vladimir Putin, it is totally legitimate to ask the question that on one hand, sure, he is representing long-standing Russian culture about both a Russian empire as well as Russian security. But on the other hand, in many ways, he's losing support among the general public. He's losing support within the Politburo. He's losing support among his Security Council within his own military and his own closest advisors. And is he at a point now where he's flailing, shadowboxing? I think that those are very, very legitimate questions to be asking.
I think that is how it's being reported to us, because I think that is the desired viewpoint that the media correspondents would like us to see. The fact of the matter is, when the Russian people are faced with who do they trust more, Moscow or what they see happening to their country, being led by NATO forces, more specifically Washington, D.C., yeah, there may be discontent with Putin. There may be protests, but by and large, more Russian people are going to trust their leadership over NATO expansion, because that's what this is all about. That's what it has always been. That's why I say Putin is actually the one who is on the defense, because he's watching the annihilation of Russia. Because if Ukraine goes, the last stronghold, the last sphere of influence goes to NATO, what's going to happen next?
That aside.
Well, no, that is the crux of that is the crux of the invasion.
The crux aside.
The quote unquote invasion.
Okay, the quote unquote crux. We have to come to terms with the fact that in what is essentially a non-democracy, an autocracy, there are chinks in the armor. Those advisors, his key military folks, are chipping away at this. The opposition to Vladimir Putin is very real. Now, we can say, hey, look, nobody wanted to go to the German front in World War II. Russian troops, civilians were being decimated, but they were rallied for the reasons that you mentioned. They were rallied and mobilized, and they fought bravely. In this instance, we're beginning to see that the Russian soldier morale and public opinion are being squeezed to unprecedented points.
That is a perfect narrative for us to jump on board and say, well, let's move forward because they're weakening. Clearly, he's weakening. The fact of the matter is, I don't believe that. I don't believe any of that, because in times of war, propaganda ramps up, and when in times of war are they ever going to project the truth about their enemy?
Well, where's the evidence that it's working then? If the evidence that it's not working is unbelievable and part of a fictitious narrative, then where is the evidence that this is working for Russia and for Vladimir Putin?
Well, that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is just because you could see 1,000 people in Moscow protest, well, there has always been 10 or 15% opposition to Putin, maybe even 25.
But it's vocal.
But this is the thing, is that now we can shift, and now we can look to what appears to be the weakening crazy man. Mm-hmm. And we can conveniently ignore the fact that this country, and I'm not going to say the American people, because I think if we knew the nature and the truth of this, and we had the choice, we would withdraw our money. But $70 billion have poured into Ukraine. Billions of dollars in arming Ukraine has been going on for several years. I believe Russia and Ukraine, had they been left to themselves, may have been able to resolve this. I know that because twice there were 2 Minsk agreements that were treaties to stop the warfare going on. But in the American mind, we can't even understand how this all started. Americans think this started February 24th with a Russian invasion. But what they don't know is 5 years prior to that, quote unquote, 5 days prior, to that Russian invasion, there had been talk about arming Ukraine with nuclear weapons. Well, why do you think 5 days later Russia comes in and comes in to secure their, what they view as their historical sphere of influence? We are conveniently ignoring the fact that there is a strategy to arm Ukraine, to draw Russia into a war, which they have already done. And this is the same playbook as the Afghanistan strategy.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last word on that. And I'm not doing anything but suggesting that we move on.
Yeah,
you aired it, right?
Well, yeah, but it's just terrible that we don't know what the Minsk agreement is. And I'm purposely not telling people what it is so that they can look it up and see what it is. That Americans understand that NATO has expanded onto Russian territory, and that is offensive and not defensive. It's offensive in nature. And I guess the last thing that I would say is, what if the United States backed off and said, you know what, we're not going to commit to Ukraine. We're just going to let Russia deal with Ukraine. We'll let Ukraine deal with Ukraine. The two of them deal with each other. And we're satisfied with the fact that we have converted the Baltic nations over to NATO. We have now gotten the Scandinavian nations to take a movement towards NATO. We have Romania and Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and Poland, and a bunch of Balkan countries. Basically, almost 90% of the former Warsaw Pact is now under NATO. By the way,
all of whom are watching Ukrainian civilians die,
and that
on their borders,
because you have to go back to 2014 and look at the coup d'état that took out a pro-Russian government and installed a Western-backed dictatorship that was friendly to neo-Nazis. And the neo-Nazis is important because that Kievan group which had broad support in the parliament, instituted policies to start shelling and bombing the ethnic Russians because they wanted to move into the Russian Federation because they feared the Kievan government. And all of that has been supported by Washington, D.C. And if we don't understand that, then we're going to have much bigger problems.
Still concerned about those civilians. All right, so I'm going to ask me a question.
Okay.
All right. Did Donald Trump have a good week? Is he in trouble? John, what do you think? Yeah, he's in trouble. And he's in trouble, obviously, legally. For starters, the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, and you will recall that Donald Trump was a citizen of New York at one point in time, but there are legions of facts and pieces of evidence showing that he was engaged in massive business fraud, in cheating banks, insurance companies, realtors, the IRS, by falsifying, inflating the values of his businesses and personal holdings, and that in fact his quote-unquote partners, meaning his two sons and his daughter Ivanka, were engaged as well. They also are facing similar charges. This is all a part of actually a number of civil cases that have been brought against Trump for acting in a fraudulent way. At the same time, the delay tactics that Trump and his dwindling number of attorneys who will work with him are engaged in terms of the his possession of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago and his response to the Justice Department FBI raid of his property. That whole situation appears that he's painting himself into a corner. He initially and continues to charge the Justice Department with being just political in an effort to get him, and then use the delay tactic by saying, before we can move on with this case, let's have a special master come in and review these documents and determine whether or not they were or should have been classified. And now, just in the last couple of days, what's happened is that an appeals court composed largely of Trump appointees has indicated that was a special master thing, was a delay tactic, and that let's move on and allow the Justice Department to review these classified documents to proceed with its case. And at the same time, what has now happened is the special master himself has told Trump's lawyers, let's get on with this. If you have real evidence that this subpoena was bogus and that this was an effort really to undermine Trump on behalf of the Justice Department, produce your evidence. And of course, by all accounts, there is no evidence. And so it appears that this week was a double whammy. You're beginning to see that at his political rallies, the size of his crowds, still significant, but nowhere near they had been. You still see that he, in polls, controls the Republican Party, although a recent poll, I think it was the University of New Hampshire, showed that Ron DeSantis would actually defeat him, whatever that means, a couple of years in advance, would beat him in a Republican primary. With all of that said, though, one has to conclude that maybe Trump has peaked and that there's a strong element of Trump fatigue that's going on, because we know now that in national polls, not only does Biden do better than Trump, but Trump is stuck at 42% in matchups against Biden, meaning that's the 42% that Trump generally gets just for showing up. That Biden, who had been unpopular, is now in the 45 to 46% range, which is a hell of a lot closer to winning than 42% is.
Well, I mean, the first thing we have to say is that there's probably a margin of error of about 3 points. So in that case, it would really be a virtual tie, which would mean that there is no Trump fatigue. Although we want to believe that there's Trump fatigue, just like we want to believe that Putin is going to be, thrown out by his own people. I can't help but notice the consistency in those messages of the media's two favorite boogeymen are to project that, well, these are people that are on their way out. Let's just do away with them. Let's, arrest them or whatever. But even if that were true, and I'll just say that I can't remember who the poll was. I looked at it this morning. It wasn't Trafalgar. Because anytime I see Trafalgar, I just assume it's always going to have the Republican in the lead. But it had 45 Biden, 44 Trump. But even if Trump were fizzling out, I think it's clear that last week that energy would then go in the camp of Ron DeSantis, who is well poised to, I think, take the MAGA vote and repackage it a little bit with more excitement. And I say that because while Donald Trump rose to fame and power in the world of politics by claiming that he was going to drain the swamp, things have changed since 2016, where the focus, from people who are MAGA Republicans is not just the swamp, but it's the threat of, you could say, the global elite or the Davos group or the Davos crowd. And DeSantis, I read his speech that he gave last week. I forgot where it was before. It was obviously before a conservative group of conservative-minded people, talked about how he stood up in the face of COVID lockdowns. He stood up to Walt Disney. He stood up to the whatever he would say, I don't know, toxic Democrats or whatever. Fact of the matter is, you could see that he's clearly positioning himself to talk about what he's done as governor, and why I think he has the potential to surpass Trump is because what is Trump going to say that he's done? I mean, yeah, he's always fighting, right, the swamp, but has he really truly fought them? Long story short, I think DeSantis could fill any vacuum, if there is a vacuum.
Agreed upon final word?
Yeah.
All right. The one thing is, I'm not going to call this a prediction, because too many folks take that too seriously. So I'm going to call it a speculation. But you heard it here first. Ron DeSantis will not be, I don't believe, even a factor in 2024. I think you're going to see a DeSantis fizzle, and that is simply for the reason that you just pointed out. He has a record. He has done things proactively, and I believe that makes him particularly vulnerable and particularly useful as a lightning rod to raise money and to mobilize Democratic voters against him. I don't believe that he'll even be a factor for that reason in a Republican primary, because I think he'll be toxic by that point in time. I think he is the flavor of the month, maybe the flavor of the year. He's also going to have some serious legal issues now, because the gambit, and I'm going to call it what it is, that gambit of flying migrants to Martha's Vineyard and now elsewhere. It's what's being revealed right now is that charter company belongs to a major conservative Republican donor who is making quite a bit of money off of that, and that one of its board members is Matt Gaetz, who is fairly toxic and faces a number of legal challenges right now, conservative young congressman from Florida. All of that will come out. But I guess the question, and let's save it for next week because it's a big question, but when we talk about the media and what the media wants us to see and what the media is portraying and how it does, I want to know more about who these folks are. Is there a power breakfast every day where the Murdoch boys and Sumner Redstone, and of course, let's put in George Soros and Bill Gates, and we need a woman.
Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah Winfrey, okay, and Sheryl, formerly of Facebook.
Sandberg.
Sheryl Sandberg. They all get together and say, all right, here's a map. How are we going to screw the world today? I'm being a little facetious, but I want to...
I'd say quite facetious.
All right, maybe quite facetious. Yeah. But I want to know more about that. Let's talk about that next week.
Well, DC consensus.
DC consensus.
DC consensus.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Last word?
Oh, I now I get, or you?
No. I got the last word.
Okay.
All right.
Unfortunately, but
no, I think it's the way America should work.
Okay.
It works better when I get the last word. Bye.